Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I am a Branford class of 74, and very, very pleased to welcome you to this Yale career panel on a candid view of healthcare data and support services. I just want to give you a brief background about the program before I introduce the panelists we have. This is the 53rd in the series that we have covered under this Yale career panels over the last 9 years. And we've covered many professions and different career issues. 43 have been Yale career panels on specific professions, and 9 have been career fireside chats where we talk about some issue like how do you network or how do you get onto a board of directors and so forth. This all started when a couple of us who recruit, I run an investment bank, and of course we recruit from Yale. And the most frustrating thing was not the quality of the students, it's the fact that they had really, really bad information about different careers. I swear, even though the Yale education, no matter which graduate school and undergraduate, is really excellent, there's really no one who tells you what it's really like to be a lawyer or what it's really like to be, an investment banker. And so a lot of people, based on watching shows on TV, so forth, they go to law school and they come out and they can't figure out why it's different than they thought and why they can't solve a case every 10 minutes, right? So, so a group of us just went to Yale and said, you really have a need, because you don't want these Yale students, who are all very bright and capable, to go down and waste 4 or 5 years going down the wrong path. And we were told, well, we don't really have the people or staff, which was true to do it. So we decided to do this. So we thought we'd do 1 or 2, and now it's 9 years later, and we've done 53. And one thing we've learned is you can't run out of professions. There are so many interesting, whether it's drama and film or architecture or so forth. And a vast majority of them have very interesting myths that in fact turn out not to be true, and it's either good or bad. The last thing I want to say is this panel, we have an excellent panel on this profession, and they can tell you about what their industry is like and their experiences and about themselves. But what they can't do is help you figure out yourself. And the one thing I'd suggest to everyone is, if you're a student or you're thinking about careers, just make sure you take some time to do a really, candid assessment of yourself, because you can learn all the great information about the legal profession and so forth. But if you have a distorted view about what you like and don't like, or what you're good at and not good at, trust me, I don't know of anyone who's totally objective about this. Try to do that. Get a friend who knows you well, but is willing to be brutally honest with you about your interest and what your real skills are, because that's a good foundation for looking at professions and saying, what's a match, right, with who I am and what my skills are. So this event is being done virtually. We used to do a combination of in-person and virtual, but we're now doing everything virtually for the moment. Because we have 5 panelists, we've extended it for about 15 minutes, so that so we have an opportunity to let all of them express their view. So the first thing I would do is, and by the way, at the end, those of you in the audience, you'll be able to ask questions, and the way we do it is just just type in your question in the chat box, and the panelists and I, as the host, will be able to see it. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our 5 panelists. And what I'd like to do is to have each of them take 2 minutes and just describe what do they do today and also how they got there. And then we'll go on and walk through a number of questions with them. So alphabetically, Alex, I guess everybody seems to be crowded in the bottom end of the alphabet. So it's hard to believe, Alexi, with the last name starting with N, but you are actually alphabetically first by last name.
That has never happened to me before with my N. I always am in the middle of the pack, whether you start with Z or A. But thanks for inviting me, Peter, and great to be on this wonderful panel. So briefly, who am I? I am today. Well, actually, I'm super branded out today. I'm sorry about that, but I'm the co-founder and CEO of this company, Nomad Health, which is in the it's a technology platform, and we help staff hospitals with short-term clinicians like nurses and others. My pathway here was kind of a long and winding one. I'm actually a physician by training. I've been in the healthcare world for the entirety of my time since I graduated from the Silliman class of 2004. And I've worn a lot of different hats. I was in the policy realm. My first job out of school was at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in Boston, which is a policy firm focused on healthcare systems improvement. I ended up going to medical school, getting my clinical training, also went to business school at a place in Boston that we don't talk about. And then got into the world of startups about 6 years after I was practicing clinically, and started this company about 6 years ago. So that's my brief journey, and looking forward to
And I'm not supposed to say this, but I've known Alexi for a long, long time. And when I first met him, he was about 3 feet tall. So it's been a long, long time. All right. So next up is Rob Martin. Rob.
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Rob Martin. I was YSPH class of 2017. I am currently a product manager at Sitka, which is a peer-to-peer telehealth platform where primary care physicians are able to make e-consult requests to specialists who, depending on the client, respond synchronously or asynchronously. And really our aim is to reduce healthcare costs while reducing wait times. And my background before Sitka, I've been in operations, strategy, product, and primarily in healthcare startups. Before Sitka, I was at Embedded Healthcare, which is a startup that's focused on applying behavioral economics to physician decision-making to reduce variation and costs in lab imaging, elective surgeries. Before that, I was on the operations consulting team at Kaiser Permanente Mid-Atlantic. Before that, I was at Aledade on the product team working on referral management, and briefly did some policy consulting for the Lewin Group around Medicare and Medicaid policy. And then my undergrad is in linguistics. And very excited to participate in this panel. I wish I had had the similar forum when I was exploring this field. So excited to be here.
And clearly linguistics was the grounding for your entire career, right?
Yeah, it's been related at times.
Tina, you're up next.
Thanks so much, Peter. Hi, everybody. My name is Tina. I'm a manager on the implementation team at Cityblock Health. Our team leads the new market expansions of our company. So anytime Cityblock decides to enter a new geography, I sort of lead the project. Super fun company. It's a healthcare startup based out of Brooklyn. And our goal is to sort of provide complex care management and primary care to underserved populations with a focus in the Medicaid and dually eligible space. I started my career at a different startup, One Medical, you may have heard of, right out of undergrad, and really enjoyed learning about patient-centered design, but ultimately decided to leave because I wasn't the right patient population that I was interested in serving. Spent some time doing HIV and STD clinical trials for a Department of Public Health. And if you ever work for a Department of Public Health, everyone will encourage you to get a master's in public health. And that's how I ended up at Yale, alongside Doug and Rob in the same program. And after grad school, went into consulting at a healthcare boutique firm, and the client that I was working with was about to sign a contract with Cityblock. And I was like, that's interesting. And so that's how I ended up at Cityblock. And it's a great blend of the healthcare startup space, patient-centered design, and also kind of tackling a population that is really near and dear to my heart. I'm really excited to chat with you all today.
Great. Doug, you're up next.
Hey everyone, my name is Doug Streat. I am based in New York City, and I am a Vice President and Chief of Staff at Aledade, which you heard Rob mention is a place that he used to work at one point in time. I'm sure we'll all have a chance to talk about our respective companies in the context of some of the conversations today. But I think it's interesting to note, everyone here today works at what a startup of some form. And we've had various experiences outside of the startup context, but I think it'll be interesting. One of the things we can talk about is what exactly are startups in healthcare? What role do they serve, and what does the startup ecosystem look like in healthcare? Because I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunities, and each of us are sort of sitting in a little bit of a different niche in the space. Aledade is a company that does value-based care physician enablement services, which is a lot of jargony healthcare words, which we can break down later. But the bottom line is healthcare spending is out of control in the United States. There are a lot of ways that companies are working to address it. There's a major market opportunity there. And several of our companies are tackling it from different perspectives. Aledade's approach is using primary care as a lever to help deliver higher quality care and keep patients out of the hospital, and in so doing, reduce the total cost of healthcare. My role at Aledade is pretty broad. I have a pretty broad portfolio that ranges from investor relations to media and public relations to executive team, personnel management and HR stuff, to day-to-day business operations, strategy, and OKR, objective and key result development, execution management, lots of stuff. So I've touched a lot of parts of the business. Before I was in this chief of staff role, was in a product role doing product management. Before I was in the product management role at Aledade, I was doing analytics work as a data analyst. So I've been with the company for 5 years and have seen it grow quite a bit from about 100 employees to about 750 today. And before Aledade, came straight out of grad school at the Yale School of Public Health, class of 2017. And before YSPH, I was at Yale undergrad, class of 16. Nice to meet you all.
Okay. Sarah, you're up next.
All right, rounding us out. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah. I'm really excited to be here today. I work for a company called Picnic Health, where I'm the head of production operations. Picnic Health is trying to rethink what patient involvement in research looks like. And so while on one end, we aggregate patient medical records so that people have access to their health information, you hear a lot about interoperability from like a healthcare provider to healthcare provider standpoint. We're trying to also include patients in that conversation. But in addition to that, patients can choose to donate their medical information to these research cohorts that we're developing to kind of expand who is participating in research and what that participation looks like. So I've been there for 2.5 years now, and I joined the company after getting my joint MBA and PhD degrees at Yale. So have a lot of shared interests with people on this panel, and actually was asked here today because I also worked at Aledade with Doug and Rob during a short period of time. So I, prior to joining Picnic Health, was in healthcare consulting, and I think I specifically wanted to go into operations because I was looking for a more like do the thing, not just like strategize and talk about doing the thing role. And so I've seen a little bit of both the consulting side of things as well as now the implementation and actually building the company, and totally echo what Doug has said, where like working at a startup feels like you just get to learn a lot and play a lot of different roles. So excited to chat with you all today.
Great. So before we get started, there are two things. One is I almost feel like I should just change the title to Yale Career Panels, a candid view of entrepreneurism, but the topic is healthcare data and support services. And I do want to make a comment. You know, when people talk about healthcare, they tend to get focused on doctors and drugs and so forth. But the reality is the healthcare data and support service is a very, very important part of making the whole healthcare system work. And we are, by the way, our next one is going to be on, you know, in the administration of hospitals and healthcare facilities, because that's also one that people don't focus too much attention on. But a huge part of the healthcare system is managing hospitals and urgent cares and so forth. So that's going to be the next one. I will ask at least panelists to take a big picture point of view, and because remember that the attendees here are looking at all different parts of healthcare data and support services. So don't get too hung up on startups, so forth, because a lot of the system out there is not startups, it's established companies doing various things. With that, probably that's a perfect segue for the first question, which is I'd like, and by the way, this is directed to any of you. So anyone who has an opinion about this should speak up. So what are the different sectors within the healthcare data and support service industry? And the reason why is I think like all professions that we've got, they're all segmented. I mean, law, you say, well, lawyer, except there's litigation, there's this, there's nonprofit. So there are many segments and they can be quite different. So can you comment on what you see as sort of the major big sectors in healthcare data and support services that the attendees should at least be aware of? And this is directed to anyone who wants to address this.
I'm happy to give it a shot here, and I'm
Go
sure
ahead, Rob. Yeah.
I'm sure that my colleagues can let me know what I may have missed. But broadly, the way that I think about the sectors, there's payers, so there's insurers, private and public. There is healthcare delivery, whether that's health systems, hospitals, physician groups, integrated systems. Startups could be included in some of that healthcare delivery or on the payer side. There's research, pharmaceuticals. Each one of those sectors or employers really has pretty distinct needs for different roles: analysts, engineering, design, product. But colleagues, anything else that I may have missed there?
Anyone?
Rob, I think I agree with you on like the macro view. I think my company also thinks a lot about like where do we fit specifically within the healthcare data ecosystem, which when I read Peter's question, took it more that way. Even the healthcare data, there's like so much interest in data in healthcare that even within that, there's a lot of different sectors. So there's kind of the people who collect the data. These can be your insurance companies, people who are getting firsthand access to that, and then a whole ecosystem of people who just aggregate data and where you can buy it from them, people like Komodo or Datavant. And then there's a whole group of like data purchasers, of people who are buying data or like figuring out what to do with that data. So I would also say that like healthcare data is a newer industry that has like been able to come more to life in the last, I would say like 10, 20 years.
And it's become very, very important because healthcare is very data intensive, and it's not just patient information, it's all this other stuff. So no, it's become a very important part of that whole system.
I love
Any comments? Go ahead, Tina.
I love that we all became Rob's coworkers. That was my favorite part. Happy to be your colleague on this panel. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's stirring this like concept of what are all the nooks and crannies of healthcare that maybe people don't know about. But when I think about data, I also think about like where is the data captured, and there's an entire world of the entire electronic health record and all the EMRs that compete for big contracts with health systems. So they're the places where data is stored, and then there's the entire processing of the actual event. So the clinical events are all captured on a claims processing warehouse, an entire back system of clearinghouses that make sure that these things are reconciled and paid out accordingly. And that information is very valuable because that's how we can sort of chase the dollar, which is where a lot of these sort of analytics people, sort of firms come into place that can, like Sarah mentioned, can help you aggregate the data and understand like where are people going to the doctor's office, which knee surgery is cheaper otherwise. And that's like a service that lots of people will pay for and are interested in understanding.
Alexi, you're obviously clearly squarely in the support, side, right, of it. Can you maybe talk about that whole sector? Because, there are so many different things under this, the support category, right?
Yeah. Well, so I think, the responses from all the other panelists really hit this on the head, that the amount of data in healthcare is truly phenomenal, and it comes in a lot of different varieties. And just to take one step back before stepping back into the question, when we talk about healthcare, it's not monolithic. I mean, some people think about, I'm interested in going into healthcare, but it's really like 17 macro segments with thousands of additional micro segments underneath. And if you just think about a single hospital, I mean, there are very few enterprises in the economy that deliver as many services as a health system or a hospital. I mean, they do everything from patient care to billing and food delivery and transportation and equipment management. And I mean, there is just so much stuff that happens in healthcare. So there's no such thing as healthcare. It's 19% of the entire GDP of the United States. We spend over $3 trillion a year on healthcare. So to try to neatly define, what it is so hard, and it's one of the reasons why we've had such a hard time, actually running an efficient healthcare system, because it's very complicated. Vis-a-vis support services, I'll even just narrow it down to the area that we work on, which is we are engaged with the healthcare workforce and just the clinical part of that workforce. And that the data shadow there is pretty large. I mean, I didn't hear anyone talk about it, and it just tells you about how much data there is. Nobody talked about, well, how many clinicians are there? Is there enough of them? Are there enough of each specialty? How many jobs are open? How much are they getting paid? What's the seasonal variation? What's the geographic variation? How does it relate to flu trends and COVID trends? And, how much should they get paid? And, what should the benefits be like? And who should employ them? And who should be, there is just a phenomenal amount of complexity to, you pick up any rock and you're gonna see a lot of critters in healthcare, which makes it so exciting and why I think there's so much entrepreneurial activity in the space. I think this, if to the extent that one could bucket a whole bunch of things as support services, I think that's an extremely interesting area, because so much of care delivery is not about clinical work. It's about so many other factors, administrative work and otherwise. And this is the stuff, to your point, Peter, that people don't really think about. They think about, oh, doctors and nurses, but there are literally millions of other types of other professionals, probably hundreds or thousands of other types of professionals who engage in the healthcare ecosystem, including just in the support realm.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we decided to do more of the things related to healthcare is we just looked at the data that was published both by Yale in terms of where Yale students are going, but also about where the jobs are. And healthcare dominates in terms of the growth in jobs, right? I mean, I guess that's good and bad, right? Maybe bad because it's such a high part of the cost of the GDP, but in terms of, from a big picture point of view, if you want to look for careers, one of the variables should be, is it a growing, healthy area that there's plenty of growth and plenty of jobs? And that is clearly the case in healthcare. Any other comments before we move on to this, the next question? Anyone? Doug, do you have comments?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to underscore a couple. I don't have a ton of additional things to add, but I want to underscore two things. One is Alexi just cited some pretty staggering numbers and just flew through them as if they were no big deal, because we do that in healthcare. But I think if you're thinking about getting into capital H healthcare as a career, it's worth spending some time reflecting on the 19-20% of the GDP number. That is a staggering amount of money that we spend on healthcare every year. $1 in $5 spent in the United States is spent on healthcare. That's mind blowing when you think about it, and it's growing. And so, to Peter's point, that is a sign of career stability for sure. It's also, I think, moral. We should all be taking that as moral injury. Like that should be concerning to all of us. And so I think there's just so much opportunity in healthcare because there's so much money, and there's also a lot of moral responsibility that I think we all bear when we get involved in healthcare. And so I think that's one thing I would add as you think about careers in healthcare. The other thing that I want to mention is, if you're interested in healthcare data and support services, which is what this panel was titled, you probably have some interest in technology, and maybe you have some familiarity with traditional SaaS technology business models. I think it's important to note that it is rare to find that kind of business model in healthcare. One of the reasons I loved the concept behind this panel is because data and support services are just hand in glove in healthcare. I usually use the phrase tech-enabled services, which I think is sort of the term of art used for most healthcare technology businesses, because it's rare to find a healthcare technology business that also isn't also a services business, because healthcare data is so complicated, the healthcare ecosystem is so complicated. It's hard to be just a pure software provider. You usually have to provide both data and support services as a technology business in healthcare. And so most businesses that I've seen are doing exactly that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'd like to move on to the next one. And this, by the way, some of these questions are the same questions that we put together for the first Yale career panel in April of 2012 on the legal profession, because it turns out some of these questions are essentially generically correct for all professions. So this next one, I want to take you to take your cheerleading hats off, right? Because everyone likes to say how great their profession is if they love it, and help answer the question is, where is the profession heading, good and bad? Now, the reason why this is for example, for doctors, right? When we had this question for doctors, they said, it's very rewarding to be a doctor, but the role of a doctor and who you're employed by has changed. And so it's really hard to be the independent doctor serving your town or whatever. Now more and more doctors are now just employees of hospitals and so forth because of the structural change. If you can't deal with that, then it's not a good idea. But if you can, but it's not something you're going to be able to change, right? So there's an example of that. So I'd like you to think in terms of this question, which is, what are good things and bad things, that are happening in your general profession that you feel the attendees should just be aware of, right?
I can jump in here, and I'm excited to hear what the others have to say, especially about the bad parts. I think very briefly on the good, we've sort of touched on it in the previous segment. This is an area of tremendous opportunity to do good things in society. If you need look no further than the fact that the need for healthcare is going to increase over the next couple of decades. The baby boom generation is turning 65 at the rate of 10,000, 11,000 people a day, and that will continue for the next 20 years. People who are over the age of 65 use 3 times as much healthcare services as people under the age of 65. People over the age of 75 use 4 times as much healthcare services as people under the age of 75. So the amount of growth and opportunity and importance of this work is only increasing, and it's extremely rewarding. You're going to work hard no matter what career you take. The nice thing is that the result of that hard work can actually be immensely meaningful to the people at the end of the equation, which is usually a patient, no matter how many links in the chain you are from it. On the bad side, I wouldn't necessarily call it bad, but it's something worth thinking about, is that because of how calcified our system is, how built for a previous era it is, this is also going to be a period of tremendous change. A lot of the sacredly held truths about how the system works, quote unquote works, will change. And it's hard to build a career and have a vision about how your career will evolve in this profession, whichever of the 17 subsectors you decide to be in. It is definitely a place where you're going to have to be very comfortable dealing with a substantial amount of ambiguity, even in the most secure parts of the profession. I'm a doctor, right? And that is a very secure profession. But what it means to be a doctor, as you just said, Peter, is changing very quickly. Yeah. And so this is definitely not a quote unquote stable profession. It's a very high opportunity profession, but you trade that reward for an increased amount of risk.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize, it's really important for you to talk to people who have reasonable crystal balls and help you think 5-10 years out. Because the reality is, for those of you who are planning to enter, and whether you're going to school of public health or whatever it may be, your experience is not next year, it's going to be 5, 10 years, 15 years from now. So try to get someone who's, folks like who are on this panel, who can look at the big picture and say, what's it going to look like in 5, 10 years or 15 years? Because that's where your career is going to be, right? Not in the next year, right? Anyone else talk about the good and the bad? It reminds me of sort of a bad Western film, right? But the title of bad Western film. But with that, anyone else?
I'll jump in here. I think that what's really good is that there's more awareness of and disruption in what we call value-based care. So paying really for the outcomes of the medical care you're receiving, instead of just as a service or fee for service. So if your mom's getting a hip replacement, really all of those stakeholders, all of the clinicians, everyone that's touching some part of that care is really thinking about the end result and not just about the specific service that they're delivering. And it's not just the Kaiser Permanente's or the ChenMeds of the world. It's really value-based care is getting beyond these large organizations that set out to do that. It's really starting to seep into other institutions that have maybe historically been a little bit more run like a business. And I'm really optimistic about that. On the other hand, this is pretty similar to what Alexi was saying, but wherever you are in healthcare, if you're going to change something, if you're going to have any improvement, disruption, or best practice that you implement, it's going to make someone upset. So you have to become an agent of behavior change and change management and really understand where is the problem? How does everyone within this system think of the problem? And then especially as someone who is collecting, analyzing, using data to make predictions, just be really aligned on what is that problem and how can data be a part of that.
Any other comments on profession heading good and bad?
I'll jump in with a couple thoughts. First of all, I totally echo the comments on payment models. I think it's true in pretty much any business that I think a good rule of thumb is that you should, and whenever you're buying a service or evaluating a company, knowing how that company is paid or how that person is paid goes a long way towards understanding their incentives. And that's true both when evaluating jobs and also when evaluating products you want to buy as a consumer. I think about it all the time. And I think in healthcare, for too long, the payment models have been fairly murky and opaque, and also have incentivized bad behavior, have incentivized just delivery of care that wasn't needed, all sorts of shady pricing behavior. And I think the industry broadly is headed in a really good direction. There's lots of promising policy moves and also plenty of promising entrepreneurism that makes that really promising. And I think that's going to be a major area of growth. I would also add that health equity is a recent focus in healthcare more broadly, and there's so much more work to do. And Tina is probably the most qualified person on this panel to talk about it. But I will say that when I think about the next 10 to 15 years in this sector, thinking about differential outcomes for differential patient populations is something that you would think we've been doing for decades, but really has not been done before. And that's happening. There's a lot of movement happening there in a way that I think is really exciting and good for society. And then I think the third thing I would say on the good is technology is more advanced than it's ever been before, and that is enabling lots of new business models. It's also enabling just better care even in incumbent business models. Telehealth is obviously the thing that comes to mind when you think about the last 2 years in the pandemic, where it really proliferated a lot, where it really hadn't existed much before. And I think telehealth is here to stay, and so are other technologies that are pretty new, but that are really changing the way healthcare is delivered, and as a result are changing the businesses of healthcare data and support services. So that's all on the good. On the bad, I mean, I'm fairly biased. I think there's a lot of good stuff happening. I would say two things come to mind. One is the same thing Rob and Alexi alluded to. When you change payment models, there will be a loser. Someone is gonna see hits to their P&L, and certain aspects of microsystems within the industry, I think of hospitals in particular, are gonna start having to innovate or see changes to their ability to be successful long-term financially. Yeah. And then the other bad thing but I think there's still plenty of opportunity. It's just where you are in the ecosystem really influences whether it's good, whether you view payment model changes as good or bad. And then I think we have some major issues with data being locked up by large incumbent companies that don't have a lot of incentive to share it. We call this sort of the interoperability problem. And Sarah's company is spending a bunch of time thinking about that and how to make that better. So Sarah's more qualified than I am to talk about that topic. But I think that is one of the things that I'm most concerned about. There is promising movement, but it's shocking to me that we're still sort of beholden to Epic and Cerner on so much. So that's what I'll say on that.
But also one thing to consider is this, the good news and bad news is healthcare is an important part of the economy. It's also bad news because it's an easy target by Congress and Senate. And they're always constantly trying to pass things, whether it's transparency of pricing or insurance or drug pricing. Often they're aiming the gun at the wrong target, right? Because they're not necessarily experts. And also they don't necessarily understand the system. So they propose things that have unintended consequences, right? So I would just say one of the bad things is a product of good thing, which is it's a big target for legislation and you don't know what they're going to do. That's the problem, right? They might do something that's good, or they might do something that's really bad, which just means that you go in knowing you might have to pivot along the way if somehow Congress or Senate does something that is really bad for the sector that you're in, right? Just prepare for that possibility. Any other comments about good or bad before we go to the next question? Okay, so question is, and this is a difficult one because you're such a diverse group in the sectors, which is, can you give the audience some sense of what might be, a typical career path in healthcare data and support services? It's a tough question, right? Because it can be quite different for a variety of different careers, right? But maybe just to give them a sense for what that might look like by giving maybe some examples in segments that are not little niche ones, but reasonably sized segments. Anyone like to do it, or just comment about your own part of the industry?
I'll bite.
Okay.
Obviously there's a lot of variation, but I think wherever you enter, even out of all of these different data segments, it's about understanding what is often contextualized as a business objective. So if you're in operations, it's keeping the clinic open, making sure that there are enough clinical assistants to staff the rooms based on the throughput of patients, the number of physicians. You could be on the product side, customer success, but in any one of those segments really has to understand what is the business objective. And so I think in terms of a career path, if you can program, if you can do any kind of modeling, whether financial modeling or otherwise, you're able to translate a lot of these business questions into some kind of model or prediction that can be used to make decisions. That's a really great way to get into a lot of these segments. But also, from the product perspective, if you really like thinking about how to consolidate business objectives and make decisions about trade-offs, there are a lot of awesome entry-level positions on the product side. I'll speak from my perspective and from my experience is that I couldn't make up my mind starting my career. And so I did a little bit of product, a little bit of analytics, a little bit of operations, and now I'm back at product. So the other thing too, which is great about healthcare, is that it does really require a certain amount of subject matter expertise, or at least willingness to learn. And so once you grab onto difficult concepts and you understand the ecosystem, it's not as hard maybe as other industries to jump in and try something else if you realize a year or two in, I really want to understand how to be a product manager, or what's important for hospital operations.
Rob, at one point, observing the five of you, but also listening to your comment, one thing that's striking is that you're not locked in. This is not a case where you join General Motors, you spend 25 years, you get a gold watch, right? And what I'm impressed by is the fact all five of you, I think it's safe to say, have made segues between segments, between jobs, and not necessarily the same job function. So, and I don't think that's true of all professions. I mean, there's some professions, you go in it, there's either one or two paths, and that's what you got to do, right? So I guess the plus of this question about a typical career path is maybe it's not so typical, and that there's a lot of mobility across job functions, and there's a lot of mobility across companies. And or you just guys are just job hoppers. I don't know, right? Any other comments about career?
I know Rob was saying that he hadn't figured out what he wanted to do early in his career, and I was going to ask him if he's figured it out yet. What's the answer,
A bit
Rob?
closer. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but you know, the good news is you're entitled to make a change if you feel that you're. By the way, one comment though is I remember I mentor a lot, and there was this young fellow who had been working for about 8 years, and he went from one large investment bank to another large investment bank to another large one, and he was unhappy. And I mentoring him, and I said, what is it that you don't like that causes you to change jobs? Is it investment banking as a task or what? He said, well, I don't like politics, and I got caught up B of A, I got caught up in politics and so forth. And I listened for about 20 minutes without saying, I said, your issue is not investment banking because you like the actual work. It's that you keep going to large investment banks. If you don't like politics, you should go to a small investment bank, right? And it had never occurred to him that the problem was not the profession, the problem was where he chose to work, right? So that's one of the things that you in the audience should think about, which is, as you think about it, also think about parameters like size and so forth beyond what the actual work. Now, the next question is one of my favorite questions because it applies to it, which is, what are some of the myths versus the realities? And it's my favorite question because so many professions, you watch TV and you think it's what we were before we started, we were talking about all these, bones and, NCS, all these forensic things. Now it's so sexy, right? These LED screens, and they all have these unbelievable, they drive fancy cars, so forth. But the reality is, if you ever went to the forensic department in the New York Police Department, it just doesn't look like NCIS, right? So I guess the question is, along those lines, are there any myths versus realities in the industry you're in that you think you would like to have known if you were in the audience today?
This will be my one spicy take of this panel. I think that healthcare in America has an incentive problem, which is a lot of the reason why you see these companies moving towards value-based care, getting more outcome-based value out of the dollars that you're spending. And I think that growing up in just societies you're from, whatever, there's this inherent idea of who the good guys and who the bad guys are, and it's driven by where the dollar lands. And I think a naive interpretation is that the doctor is providing all this care and they care about me so much, and they must be the good person in this equation, and the big bad pharma and the big bad insurance company. And it's very easy to create this dichotomy, which is perpetuated by, I think, society largely. This is an industry, and there are players in this space, and they are companies, and there are dollars that we pay as taxpayers, and there are dollars that companies invest in. It is all an incentive-based infrastructure. And so there isn't a one sort of person who gets the bad rap or the good rap. I think everybody is at some point culpable in the equation because of the system that we have in this country and how we have things set up. It could be different in a future, a glowy, Norwegian system, but we don't have that here. And so I think knowing that and walking in is really refreshing, because then you can see I can do good, and I can do good for people from every angle. You could work at a health plan and really change the lives of folks that you work with, and you could work at a hospital and do the same, and you could work at a pharmaceutical company and create drugs that change people's lives. And so I think don't go into it with this assumption of who the good and the bad are, but be very curious about what motivates different segments of this industry forward.
Yeah, and be aware before you just be brutally aware of what the real incentives are, so you won't be disappointed, right? Right.
I totally agree with you. And I think maybe not as spicy of a take as you might have believed. And I think as an extension of that, I actually think that like one of the realities is that a lot of people go into healthcare because it's, a feel-good industry, you're helping people. And I think that is fundamentally true. But I also think that like at 19% of GDP, like we actually should be spending less on healthcare. And so there are definitely companies that probably shouldn't exist. And I definitely have had friends working at companies that weren't doing so well. And then you see like more shady practices come through. And so I guess the myth that like every company that works in healthcare is doing good is not necessarily true. And as you're job hunting, like definitely ask the questions about like, how are they getting paid? What are their goals? And if the answer is, just around staying around to make more money, then like question if that's where you want to be. But I think that's the general myth that I don't buy, that like every company should exist in perpetuity.
Any other comments about myths versus the realities?
I have one, which with all due respect to Alexi, which is that you don't have to be a doctor to work in healthcare. I think this is a personal one for me, as I think most people on this panel know, including Peter, because we talked about this when I was going through the process. But I personally was seriously considering medical school for a long time. Still haven't entirely ruled it out, but that's a side note. But I went as far as taking the MCAT, applying to medical school, getting into medical school, accepting an offer, deferring again, and then withdrawing my acceptance. And that journey for me has been emotionally fraught for a lot of reasons, tied up in identity and all sorts of other questions that I think lots of people go through. But one of my reflections is that I think there is often this assumption, especially among relatively early career ambitious people, that to sort of be really make profound impacts on the healthcare ecosystem, you have to be a physician. And it is true that it can be very helpful. And if you care a lot about delivering clinical care directly, there's I think nothing, from what I hear, there's nothing more profound than that experience. However, most people who work in healthcare are actually not clinicians. The clinicians are, maybe surprisingly to some, the minority of people employed in the healthcare data and support systems ecosystem, and even healthcare more broadly. And so there are ways to contribute with other degree paths and other educational paths.
But to be fair, I think there are wonderful perspectives you can have if you are a doctor going into other areas. Some of my best friends start out as doctors and now are CEOs of biotech companies or others, or like in Alexi, it started out as now helping on the whole support side. But it gives you a different perspective than you might if you'd had a different career path. And I think Alexi is probably becoming more common for doctors than to go into other professions. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely true. I think so. First of all, when I was applying to medical schools, I knew that I wanted to do this kind of hybrid life, and I knew I wanted to go to business school, which I ended up doing. And I had to be very secretive about that when I was applying to medical school, because it was not a thing that was done. At the time, there were only 6 MD, MBA joint programs in the entire United States. Now there are, I can't even count how many there are, and how all the students, are trying to do it. And I think that it is definitely becoming more common. And I do think that there is some true value to that ability to be sort of bilingual, to speak the clinical language and the business language. But it is by no means a necessary, a necessary component of being a successful leader or professional in the healthcare system to have actually been a clinician. And as Doug said, the vast majority of people who are in healthcare are not. But drawing back on something that Rob said earlier on in the conversation, you do need to have some subject matter expertise. Healthcare is a unique and complicated realm. And so, in order to have any chance at doing something successfully, whether it's promulgating the existing system or changing the system, you do need to know how the system works. And that what you will see is that most of the people in kind of leadership positions have some degree of specialized training and knowledge, whether you're an MPH or you had years of frontline exposure, or you're a clinician, but it is, I think, an important thing if you want to be in a leadership role. If you want to be on a frontline, sort of frontline position or more functionary role, it's not absolutely required. But I do strongly recommend if you want to be in this field to be at least willing to be a student, a very serious student of the complexities and strangeness of our little corner of the world, our little 19%.
Totally agree, Alexi. And yeah, I mean, if you think about this panel alone, every single person on this panel has an advanced degree. A couple of people have multiple, MBA, MPH, MD, lots of options. And so I think I totally could not agree more with that point.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily necessary, but
and I do think life sciences and general healthcare does require, unless you're just in finance or something, does require extensive industry knowledge, which is just can't. That my firm, I was at an industry group head at Lehman and Solomon, and then when we started my firm, we focused on life sciences and chemicals. And why? Because industry knowledge, detailed industry knowledge, is a minimum in order to function, right? And so it's actually a reasonable, if you want to have a specialty, defendable specialty, it's viable. So that's definitely true. Now, the next one is also an interesting and slightly tricky question, which is, what are the characteristics of people who tend to do well and are happy in the profession? And I want to illustrate this with an example, which is try to think in terms of a broader sense. So, and people don't always think in this way. So, for example, if you are a person where you get very upset if a project you have to work on takes more than 3 months, you should not be a professor, right? Because you can't write a book in 3 months. And you turn the opposite, direction, you can come up with the same answer. If you like being outdoors, better to be a forest ranger or something like that than to work, in an accounting firm, right? So these are the kinds of bigger, personal characteristics that I think can make a big difference whether someone's happy or unhappy, independent of the actual analytical content, right? So can you think of things that in your space of healthcare data and support services, are there characteristics that you think if you match that, you got a better chance of being happy being in the profession, right?
I really like this question because this is one of my favorite things about healthcare and why it's such a great fit. I think there's some industries that are like straightforward. If you're like selling Diet Cokes, you want to sell as many Diet Cokes as possible, and there's lots of strategies to get your Diet Coke to more stores and more people, and there's advertising and there's product placement, and the book is kind of written on how to be successful for the most part, and you're sort of chasing the largest number of drinkers. Healthcare fails all the traditional standards of a traditional market, and it's just so sticky and complex. There's not the perfect supply of providers, and then there's not perfect share of information, and the person who decides that you need a surgery is not the person who pays for the surgery and doesn't get the utility out of the surgery, which is you who's getting it. And so it creates this very sticky environment. Every action you take has not just one corresponding reaction, but reverberations around the industry. And any policy change that happens is the same way. It impacts so many different slices of what we do. And that is really big and fun to wrangle. And so if you like to solve puzzles and you realize that it's not straightforward and you're not going to solve the puzzle and then kind of like coast, you're just going to constantly think about how to make it better, tied to the fact that there are real material outcomes, like we're not selling Diet Cokes, we're like selling people's health and wellness. And that's really important. And maybe selling is the wrong word, but we're providing those things. So if you like to solve sticky things and do it for something that has like high stakes, this is kind of the place that you get to do that.
But Tina, I think you're making a really good point along that broader sense, which is if you're the kind of person who likes a set of rules and apply it to a certain situation and come to an answer, sounds like what you're in is not the place, because there's no, the things keep moving around. There's no formula. Now, I started out in my career for 2 years. I became a CPA in like 2 years. And there's a profession where they don't want you to be creative, right? They want you to take the rule and apply it to the situation and say, and come to, and then say it either fits or doesn't fit, right? And so there's an example of something where it's the other end of the spectrum. So if you don't mind, I guess you're saying, Tina, if you don't mind ambiguity and the fact that the circumstances may shift and you'll come to a different answer, then healthcare data and support services is the place for you. Is that right, Tina?
For sure. There's definitely protocol-driven pockets of healthcare. So if you're decided on healthcare, you can find a protocol-driven space for you, but data and support services and delivery and kind of the space that I work in, there's lots of ambiguity and change, which again, if you're cool with that, it's very exciting.
Do the fellow panelists, you agree, or you have a different characteristic you want to point out?
I completely agree with Tina. First of all, to all the Diet Coke lovers out there, worry not. There are legions of Diet Coke drinkers in the healthcare sphere, so we welcome you. But she's absolutely right. I think dealing with ambiguity and complexity is a sine qua non of doing anything in healthcare. I would add a couple of other adjectives that describe a person who would be successful here. First is a comfort with conservatism. I think healthcare by nature is a slow-moving series of entities, which is appropriate. I mean, we're talking about people's lives, their health and their well-being, and so we don't try things willy-nilly. Creativity is important, but you have to be patient, to see results from your creativity, because it is a by default conservative environment. I think you have to be also comfortable with the idea that it's a teamwork oriented profession. Regardless of what role you play, you are going to have to work with other people given the complexity of the profession. So there's no sheer force of will success in healthcare, or certainly not a sustainable success. Whether you're a clinician, if you're a doctor, you got to be able to work with nurses and dietitians and care coordinators and insurers. And if you are trying to change insurance, you got to be able to work with health systems and clinicians and financial actuaries. You have to be able to do teamwork. There's no way around that. If you want to be a truly independent operator, this is not the world for you. This is not the solo virtuosic place. And I also, it's kind of depressing to say, but you have to also be very comfortable with a lot of things not going exactly the way that you want them to. There's like littered with failure, even if everybody has an alignment on what the way things should be. Again, given the complexity, very often the pathway towards that vision is very circuitous, very messy, and often does not arrive at that final destination, which, as I said, is depressing for all the optimistic people who end up going into healthcare. But it is something that's important to know when you go in. The idealism that drives so many people to medical school, nursing school, you name it, public health school, when confronted with the reality of the healthcare system, takes itself down several pegs. But it's something I think that you should always keep. You have to be very optimistic to buoy yourself. And that's probably why there's a lot of burnout in our profession. I mean, I think that's one bad thing that none of us has brought up, but I do think it's very important for us to recognize. I think the positives of of the many different types of professions you can have in healthcare, data and services, and a variety of other places in healthcare far outweigh those negatives. But again, we're trying to give, I think, early career advice, and I would strongly encourage people to understand the meaningfully challenging elements of being in this environment.
Well, these are really great points. Alexi, I really liked your points because they're really, really important. So, you know, and I hadn't thought about the fact that in general, what you guys are doing requires working with lots of people and in teamwork. So the message here, by the way, is if you are a rules person and you don't like working with other people, right? This is not the place for you, right? So that's one of the takeaways. Any other characteristics that, you know, Sarah or Rob or Doug would like to point out? I mean, this is very helpful because, again, I think for these attendees, what we aim is to arm them with the perspectives that allow them to make intelligent choices, right? And to compare it to themselves. By the way, I was pre-med for the first 2 years at Yale, right? I was a physics math major, and I ended up going to the business school that Alexi doesn't want to talk about, but up in Boston. But I had a revelation, and I had a revelation in between my sophomore and junior year, and I was in a program for 3 months where I followed 2 doctors around for the whole 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months that I had lunch with them, and they said, "Do you mind if we're candid with you?" I said, "Well, I guess it depends." But they said, "The good news is you would be an excellent doctor." So I was feeling pretty good. And I said, "Well, that's great because I'm pre-med." And they said, "The bad news is we don't think you should be a doctor." But all their points were these personal characteristics, right? Which is the matching of my personality and with being a doctor at the time. And so I totally switched my major to economics and went to business school, which was a better match. But, you know, there's an example where I personally went through that experience and never got to be a doctor so that I could switch into something else, Alexi, right? Any other comments about what makes people happy characteristics?
I might jump in with one more thing. I think I totally agree with Tina and Alexi and what they said. I think also if you're thinking about your early career, I think curiosity goes a really long way in healthcare. There's just so much that is unknown, and we're on a panel about healthcare data. Data in healthcare is messy and is still a relatively like nascent industry. And so there's a lot, if you're like an entry-level analyst, like if you're curious and able to dig in, you might find something. And that is not necessarily true of every industry because healthcare is like interconnected. You're often using data sources from lots of different places. And so if you can stick it out through the messiness of like, you know, blank cells or irrationally large or small numbers, if you can stick it out, being really curious and kind of connecting the dots can really go a long way in wherever you're kind of working.
Yeah, that's great. That's really wonderful. Any other comments before we move on?
I mean, I'll just tag on to Sarah's point to paint a picture, which is no one on this call is secretly a coder, at least as far as I know, and yet I can think of multiple instances sitting down with both Sarah and Rob at various points in our time when we overlapped at the same company, writing SQL queries to query our database. Even though that wasn't part of our job description, because that sort of data orientation is the sort of thing that is expected, I think, at baseline for you to be at least interested. Not saying that you need to come in with tons of programming experience or anything like that, although certainly that helps. But being interested and curious and being at least baseline, facile with thinking about data and thinking about numbers can be really helpful in this industry.
So do you have to be a quant or a computer scientist to succeed? Yes, no, maybe?
Definitely not, but being interested, I think curiosity is exactly the right way to put it. I think Sarah got it totally right. Which you don't have to have the expertise to start, but you should be interested in developing at least some knowledge.
Yeah. So I always like to, we've got about 10 minutes left and we have at least one question, but I know I gave you the list of questions I was going to ask, but now I'm going to ask you a surprise question. Okay. And that is, and I want each of you to answer. Now, this is one where each of you has to comment. And that is, as you think 5 to 7 years out, what do you think you're going to be doing? Is it the same, but at a more senior level? Is it going to be something different? Any thoughts? Alexi, of course, I know you're going to sell your company, make a lot of money, and 5 years from now, you're going to be down in the Bahamas, right, sipping pina coladas. I understand that, but that aside, that's a scenario aside. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I'll be drinking Diet Cokes, not pina coladas. But you know, I think I have this little theory about what it means to be a professional, and it's important to recognize that I think there's just two types of professionals. There are the creatives and the virtuosos. I don't know that this is a valid theory, but it seems to work for me. And I think that the things that each of those categories of people like to do are very different, and yet they're both vital to the proper functioning of professionals. The virtuosos are the people who delight in achieving perfection, and that's your cellist, your surgeon, your free throw shooter, you name it. Someone who likes getting from 99% perfection to 99.9% perfection, delighting in that. I think the creatives are the people who like getting from 0 to 90%, and it's this constant acquisition of new knowledge, new experiences. And it was actually, it dictated why I moved from being a physician, which is a virtuosic profession, to becoming an entrepreneur, which is more of a creative profession, because I like constantly doing new things. So if I had to predict what I would be doing, you said 7 years from now, I mean, I think it's very likely that I'll be working on a new problem in healthcare. And trying to take something from 0 to 1. I don't know in what capacity. I don't know if I'll be the founder of the company again, an employee, an executive in one of those companies, an investor. I don't know, but I do know that what I want to do is to sink my teeth into the many problems that this industry we've chosen to be in has, and work on fixing it. And that's very exciting. I don't care if I make any money doing it. It's actually just really intellectually stimulating. That's why I chose this profession.
Well, you don't have to worry about it because you'll have sold your company and made a lot of money. So then you'll be able to work, you're going to be able to work pro bono, Alexi, right? But knowing you, I know whatever you do, you'll do in a first-class way. Sarah, your answer to that question, 5 to 7 years out, crystal ball,
Yeah.
what are you going to be doing?
Well, again, I think the most important thing I've learned in my professional career is that picking where you work, you should look at who you're going to be spending all of your time with. And that I think early on, there's this like bright-eyed, like I'm going to go work for my dream company. And the reality is like, you can work for your dream company, but if the people that you're working with are not, your type of people, that's not going to be a good experience. And so follow people and as much as, anything else that might be driving you. So I guess when I look ahead, I know that will be certainly one part of it. And I think the other thing that I didn't get to mention earlier, but would have been what I said about where the profession is heading. I do think we're creating a healthcare system of like two disparate ones. One where if you have the money, you can pay for a lot of excellent, amazing services. And one where, the like basic fundamental healthcare rights that people should have may not be getting serviced. And so that like health equity question is really important to me. And so I can see myself in 7 years, 7 years, working on really tackling that piece of it and thinking about how do we bring up the floor of like what everybody has access to, and doing that with a group of people who I see myself fitting in with.
Great answer. Wonderful. Rob? your answer?
Oh, these are both great answers so far. I know that I'm pretty sure I'll be at an early stage startup. I also really enjoy nasty problems. When I'm not working and not having free time, I have 3 kids, and one thing that's really near and dear to my heart is pediatric care, and especially the lack of pediatric care at home.
Right.
And one thing that I've seen personally and professionally, just how powerful it could be to empower, parents, other informal caregivers, to really create a continuum of care. So yeah, I think I'd like to do something in that space in a few years.
Wonderful. Tina, you're next.
I hope that we solve this incentive problem before 7 years, but I don't know that we will. And so I will probably still be working on trying to figure out how to best align incentives in healthcare that provides people who live here with the, best health outcomes. I like to build things, and that's one thing I've learned over time. And so working in the startup sphere where you get to really feel like you built the thing from scratch is a big bit. Alexi, I'm going to keep that virtuoso creative framework in my head for a while from now on. I like that. But yeah, probably definitely value-based care, probably in this type of setting again.
Well, that's a good answer. And Doug?
I think I'm going to be working with Tina and Alexi apparently, because my answer is somewhere in a pretty similar range, which is, I think for me, a guiding principle in all of my career decisions to date has been this idea of alignment. I think tell me how you're paid and I'll tell you who you are is a phrase that I think about a lot. And we've talked about that earlier. We're just sort of coming full circle. But for me, when I think about my career decisions, I think about the people I'm going to work with. Totally, I think that was a really good point, Sarah. And I think about how is that company going to get paid, and how is it going to be aligned with the what I want the world to be, how I want the world to exist in the future. And so I will be at, I think, similarly an early stage company. I hope to found a startup at some point. So maybe that'll be where I'll be in 5 to 7 years. Maybe I'll be an early employee at one. I don't know, but something working on value-based care with aligned financial models in mind as an end goal in an early stage entrepreneurial setting.
Well, no one has explicitly said this, but it's clear that for all of you, one of the factors is a fit between your personal values and what you're doing. That's true for all 5 of you. No one said it explicitly, but you basically, by virtue of the examples you gave it. And I guess, I would just say that that is something that is important, but it's not necessarily true of everyone. I mean, there's some people there, they just say, I just want to make a lot of money. I don't really care about what. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's a legitimate, as long as you know yourself and you know what you're doing. But clearly, one thing about, I guess, about healthcare is at least it creates greater opportunities for you to do something where it helps people, right? Whereas I think that's not true in other professions as directly. Now, I'm a firm believer that you should start on time and end on time, and we have about 2 minutes left, and we have a question. And so this is from anonymous attendee, whoever that is. The goal of patient clinical care is being challenged in the midst of, quote, change, unquote, especially with the amount of time physicians now have to spend in the emergency room entry, which does not directly affect the patient's clinical experience. Can the panel address how this issue, I guess your industry, can preserve the value of physician-patient interaction in the midst of the demand for increase in data?
I think this is a great question. And to already borrow Alexi's framework, I think here, the idea that we're going to take EMR entry and just make it better and better is like the 90% to 100%. My personal opinion is this is an area where we just really need disruption. How do we get the patient? How do we get a video feed? How do we get the primary care physician with the patient, doing a synchronous consult? How do we have some amount of automation and pull text from what a physician dictates or a video. That's my personal opinion.
Any other comments? Okay, well, anyone who's had to wait in the waiting room of a doctor's office and experience that can say, if this was a restaurant, they'd be out of business, right? So Rob, that's to underscore your point. The healthcare system could learn a lot from other industries to figure out how to be more efficient and so forth. And I went for an exam annually. They said show up 15 minutes early. I did. 2.5 hours later, I saw the doctor. And I said, I thought I was the first appointment. He says, well, no, you were the third appointment. So look, I just want to, first of all, thank the 5 panelists for your participation. It was wonderful perspectives. The 5 of you are not the same, so you gave different answers with different perspectives, which is why having a diverse panel is really a wonderful thing. And I hope that this was very helpful to the audience. I think it was. And I'll just tell all those of you who are attending that if you want to binge watch and watch this one over and over again, it's being recorded, and it'll be in a few days, it'll be on yalecareerpanels.com, or you just really feel that your mom really ought to watch, just tell her to go to that website. But again, thank you very much for the 5 panelists for a wonderful job. And I'm looking forward 5 years from now to see what all of you are doing, other than the pina colada on the beach that Alex is going to have, right?
Diet Coke.
Diet Coke, right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much.
Peter.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.